Hello, and as we continue to look at the Old Testament prophets associated with the exile of the nation of Judah, we come in this session to look at the prophet Daniel. So Daniel, as we've already noted, was taken into exile in the year 606 BC, one of the first of the exiles to go to Babylon. And he's a major figure in the prophecies that he foretold right the way down to the last days. So his prophecies concern major future events and the rise and fall of various world powers. And as we read through the book of Daniel, we see how God is sovereign over the nations. He raises up nations and he casts them down. So there is a revelation of things to come through the book of Daniel. So as we look at him as an individual, the man, his name Daniel means God my judge. And Daniel chapter 1 verse 3, we learn that he is from an aristocratic family because they were the first ones to go into exile. The first batch of exiles were the leaders. And also we know he's a very righteous man. We can tell from the book itself, but also in Ezekiel chapter 14 verse 14, 20 and 28 verse 3, Daniel is mentioned by God as a righteous man. So he clearly has a very high position so far as God is concerned. So he came to Babylon as a young man, no doubt a teenager, and was taken into the royal court for training. So as a member of the aristocracy in Judah, he and his friends were no doubt considered suitable for being trained up as leaders in Babylon. And so that training did actually help him a great deal, because he was going to spend the rest of his life in some form of government, participating in as prime minister for a long time of the biggest empire in the world at that time. So he had a traumatic childhood, or as a young teenager, having been captive and taken all the way from Judah, the hundreds of miles to Babylon. So the question then is, why was this young man who was thrust into this Eastern court with all its glamour and all its splendor, but together with its shame and corruption, why was he able to stand as a righteous man before God and maintain his character all the way through his life? So from the moment we're first introduced to him as a young teenager, all the way through to the end of his life. And he lived to be an old man, but always stood for God in the midst of this corrupt society. And not only being in it, but actually working for them as a great testimony for the God that he was very careful to give glory to. So why was Daniel able to do that? Well, first of all, then he was a man of purpose. So Daniel chapter 1 verse 8, we find he takes his stand for God in the refusal of the food that he was given. And secondly, he was a man of prayer, even when he was surrounded by the most adverse circumstances. It didn't stop him praying. 3 times a day he would pray towards Jerusalem. So he was always conscious of God's presence, always took time to pray. And he was also a man of perception. He was able to hear from God, hear from God what the Spirit was saying. And here's a great example of how God's people can be an ambassador or ambassadors in a secular surrounding. So we're in this world, we're not of this world, but we're here to be a great example. And Daniel stands head and shoulders above many as a great ambassador for God in a fallen world. So as we come to look at the book, 12 chapters, it falls conveniently into two parts. So chapters 1 to 6, much of it is historical concerning Daniel. And chapters 7 to 12 focus more on prophecies that stretch down through the centuries and millennia. So just a reminder of the historical background then. So as we saw when we were looking at Ezekiel, Daniel and Ezekiel were contemporaries. Ezekiel coming to Babylon just a few years later in the second wave of the exile. And so whereas Daniel was living and working in the court, Ezekiel was living amongst the thousands of exiles in Babylon and prophesying there. So as we mentioned before when looking at Ezekiel, there were three parts to the exile: 606, 605, 606 when Daniel and the aristocracy were deported, 597 when the second wave, including Ezekiel, were deported, and then finally 586 when the remainder of the people were exiled to Babylon. Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple burnt. And also during Daniel's lifetime, because he lived a long life, we know that he lived well into his 80s, around 538, 536 BC, under King Cyrus, the Babylonians were overthrown. Daniel was still there, still being used, and Daniel lived then to see the beginning of the restoration, where a group of the exiled Jews went back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah. And so the temple was finally rebuilt in 515 BC. So Daniel's life then covered the whole of the exile, 70 years of it. Right, so as we start to look at the first six chapters then are not too complicated. So chapter 1, we've got Daniel and his three friends making a stand for God. And they refused the food that the king wanted them to have. Now, what was the reason they did that? It wasn't because they were vegetarians. They were permitted to eat meat under the laws of Moses. But probably the issue was that the meat was sacrificed to idols. And so for Daniel and his friends, it's no doubt a matter of principle that they would not eat non-kosher meat. And so hadn't been killed according to the laws of Moses. So that was probably the issue as to why they didn't eat the meat. But, with the vegetables and fruit, no doubt, that they were given, they thrived because, of course, God was with them. So chapter 2, then, we have the first of a number of dreams that we find in the book. So this time it's Nebuchadnezzar's dream that frightened him, and he because he didn't want to be deceived by his own magicians, he made the condition that he wouldn't tell them the dream, they would have to tell him. So very cleverly saying, if you are inspired by your gods, as they had, then let your gods tell you the dream that I had, and then interpret it. Well, of course, they couldn't do that, but God revealed it to Daniel. So a very important dream, because it demonstrates then 4 or 5 really powers that were going to arise in the years following Daniel. And with the hindsight of history, we can look back and say, exactly as prophesied it happened. So the dream then was this colossal statue with a head of gold, shoulders and arms of silver, body of bronze, and legs and feet, a mixture of, well, the legs were iron, and the feet, toes, a mixture of clay and iron. And we looked at this when we were looking at the preparation of God's preparation for the coming of Christ. But just to recap on what we've said before. So these four metals represented the rise of various kingdoms. So the head of gold, Daniel said, represented Babylon. That was to be followed by the body of silver was the Medes and the Persians, who would overthrow the Babylonians. The bronze was Greece, that would overthrow the Medes and the Persians. And then finally, the hardest metal of all, Rome, the Roman Empire, would rise up. But then a fifth kingdom would arise, and that would be a miraculous stone cut without hands that would hit this statue, would be smashed to smithereens, and the stone would fill the whole earth. That stone, of course, representing the kingdom of Christ. So the Babylonian Empire was a head of gold in chapter 2. It lasted about 70 years, and Daniel lived to see, lived through that. So they were responsible then for the captivity of the Jews, which we've looked at already, in fulfillment of the Old Testament covenant. So Leviticus 26, chapter 26, and Deuteronomy chapter 28, both list the conditions of the covenant. Follow me, God says, and I'll bless you. Follow my ways, I'll bless you, protect you, look after you as a nation. Turn your back on me, turn to idols, and I will allow you to be overrun by enemies and finally deported. And so Babylon was the nation that God used to fulfill that. Then we had the Medes and the Persians. So silver, a little less precious than gold, but a bit stronger than gold. So the Medes and the Persian kingdom ran from 538, 539 to 333 BC. That's when, at which point Alexander the Great rose to power. And we noted that 200 years earlier, Isaiah had prophesied that an empire would arise that would defeat the Babylonians, and it would be the Medes. So Isaiah 13, 17 to 19, see, I will stir up against them the Medes, Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, will be overthrown. And Jeremiah had prophesied specific details as to how the Medes would conquer the city of Babylon, that we will look at when we look at the book of Jeremiah 51, 32. And then the third one would be the stomach and thighs of bronze. This would then be the Greek Empire that overthrew the Medes and the Persians. So a Greek king, Philip II, after whom the city of Philippi was named, had a son called Alexander, who was known as the Great, and he fulfilled these biblical prophecies. So just as bronze is inferior to silver and gold, Alexander's empire didn't last very long for himself, but when he died at a very young age, he's only 32 when he died. And in his time, he had conquered from Greece right away across to the Indus River in India, all the way down through the Middle East down to Egypt. So in a very short space of time. But when he died, he had no heir, so his empire divided into 4 parts, each one led by one of his 4 generals. And then Daniel had foretold this also, as we'll see as we go through the book, 200 or so years earlier. So the Greek Empire then divided into 4 parts. Two of the parts would be significant to Israel. There was a dynasty of the family called the Ptolemies that ruled Egypt, and they were south of Israel. And then to the north of Israel was the dynasty of the Seleucids, and Israel was caught in the middle. So Daniel comes to prophesy about that a little later on. But from one of the Seleucid kings came a man or a ruler called Antiochus Epiphanes, 175 BC. Now, he was very cruel to the Jews who had returned. And he persecuted the Jews. He desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on it. And he is very much a forerunner or a picture or a type of the Antichrist. So there are a lot of similarities between what he did and what the final Antichrist is going to do in the last days. And often you see with prophecies, you have more than one fulfillment. So God used each then of these empires for his own benefit. The Babylonians were the ones to deport the Jews. The Medes and the Persians were the ones to send them back, or at least a proportion of them back, to rebuild the temple. The Greeks left their language of Greek universally that helped in the spreading of the gospel, because all the nations spoke Greek of that empire. And the Romans, the final empire, was the ones of iron and clay. So, and their empire left military rule over a large part of the known world, which made spreading the gospel easier, because in times of war that's not possible so easily. Famous engineers, they built roads that enabled the takers of the gospel to move very quickly, built for their troops originally, of course. And their empire spread from right up to the border of Scotland, all the way through Europe, all around the Middle East and North Africa. And under their rule was something called Pax Romana, which was the Roman peace, which then enabled the gospel to flourish. So Daniel prophesied that during that fourth empire, there would come a supernatural empire that would emerge, this rock cut without hands, so miraculous origin that would smash this empire and all empires and would fill the earth. So during the Roman Empire, of course, in a little village in Judea called Bethlehem, there was the fulfillment of other prophecies. Numbers chapter 24, 17 to 19. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel, a ruler will come in peace. A ruler will come out of Jacob. And so, starting with the prophecy to Adam and Eve, that the offspring of the woman would crush the Satan, basically. God became a man, fully God, fully man. Galatians 4, chapter 4 to 4, verse 7. When the time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights as sons. And by 312 AD, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And if we look at Revelation chapter 17, verses 7 to 14, some see a relationship between this aspect of Daniel's dream and the prophecies of Revelation 17, 7 to 14, when it relates to the Antichrist. Some believe that the Antichrist will come out of a revived Roman Empire, of which there'll be 10 kingdoms. So the stone then, the fifth kingdom, smashed them all, filled the whole world, and this is the kingdom of Christ. And Daniel also, as we go through the book, has other references to the Messiah. So the stone, called the stone in Daniel's prophecy, Psalm 118 verse 2, Christ is the headstone. Isaiah 28:16, he's the foundation stone. And here is the stone that breaks all kingdoms. So that's chapter 2. We go into chapter 3, and this is a fairly straightforward story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow down to the king's idol, and as a consequence were thrown into the fiery furnace. The significant thing about that, well, several significant things, but their faith was such that they said, we believe God can save us, but if he doesn't, we're still not going to obey you and your idolatrous ways. And of course, the significance of the fire, that as they looked into the fire, there was a fourth person who looked like a son of the gods, as the pagans described Jesus. But of course, it was Jesus there with them in the fire. Very powerful symbolism for us. Jesus with his people in the fire. Moving on to chapter 4. Chapters 2 and 3, Nebuchadnezzar has a nodding acquaintance with the true God. But in chapter 4, he writes to say how his desire is that throughout his empire, the people should know the true God, who is the God of the Jews, Daniel's God. So he had a period of insanity, but nevertheless, he bows down to the God of Daniel and issues a decree. So he has this dream of a large tree that's cut down. It frightened him. His wise men failed to interpret it, but Daniel was able to, because God gave him the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar was a proud man. He had a great empire. And in the dream, God reminds him that God's watching and is able to intervene in the situation when needful. So in the dream, he hears chapter 4, verse 14. He called out in a loud voice, "Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit." So Nebuchadnezzar is warned, and Daniel tries to warn him. He's been Nebuchadnezzar's advisor now for something like 30 years, and it's quite clear that they have a very good relationship with one another. And Daniel did not want to see Nebuchadnezzar cut down. And so he tells the truth to Nebuchadnezzar, and for 1 year, everything seems to be all right. But then after a year, his pride gets the better of him, and Nebuchadnezzar his pride overcomes him about everything that's been built round about him. And that's the moment then when he lost his reason and he believed he was an animal. So he had a period of insanity, which lasted for 7 years. And this is actually a known disease. And it's called lycanthropy. And it's a disease that of the mind, where people imagine that they're an animal of some sort, a beast of some sort. Well, after time, Nebuchadnezzar returns to sanity. He proclaims the reality of the true God. So he's repented, and then he fades out of the picture. So that's the end of Daniel's dealings with Nebuchadnezzar. And then we move on into chapter 5, which deals with a ruler called Belshazzar. And again, straightforward story. They're having a feast. King Belshazzar's having a feast. mocks the true God by getting out from their treasury the stolen gold articles from the Temple of Jerusalem, because they're still in Babylon, having been looted in 586 BC, and uses them for this feast. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had died some years later. There had been several other kings that had taken the throne just briefly. So there was Amul-Marduk, who reigned from 562 BC to 560 BC, followed by Neriglissar, who was only on the throne for a year or less than a year. Nabonidus, who was on the throne from 556 to 539. Now, he was the father of Belshazzar, so he was the rightful king and the monarch in Babylon. But he associated his son Belshazzar with him in government. So that's the reason why, when Belshazzar was desperate to find someone who could interpret the writing on the wall, which spelt out Belshazzar's downfall, he said, I'll give you a third position in government, in the kingdom, because he himself was the second in control, so he could only give the third ruler. But anyway, it was not to be, because that very night, as the fingers wrote on the wall the downfall, that he'd been weighed and found wanting, that very night the Babylonian kingdom fell. So Belshazzar, he was not a strong ruler. He was cruel and licentious, as far as history reveals. And it seemed pretty clear that he and Daniel had nothing in common. So Daniel is very familiar with Nebuchadnezzar, and also with Cyrus, who takes over when Babylon is conquered. But there doesn't seem to be any relationship with Belshazzar, and that no doubt because he's a very unpleasant character. Not the sort of person that Daniel could work with, no doubt. So his last act of profanity was to desecrate the vessels from the kingdom, from the temple, and that was his downfall. So that very evening, Babylon fell. Now, this we've seen as we looked at the different prophets. A number of prophets have foretold the downfall of Babylon. Now, just to get an idea of the enormity of this event, Babylon was an impregnable city. It goes right the way back to Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10, verses 9 to 10. And it was a magnificent ancient city. And it was encompassed by walls that was 87 feet thick, 350 feet high, surrounded by a 35-foot moat. And there were 250 watchtowers all the way around. And with a population of perhaps up to 1 million people living in beautifully designed houses. So it was an astonishingly magnificent city. And the writing on the wall said time was up. Well, the Euphrates River ran diagonally across the city. And what happened was that when the kings and the nobles were feasting outside, thinking that they were totally safe, outside, the Medes and the Persians, they diverted the river, and they were able to enter the city up the bed of the river under the walls with the help of a couple of deserters from the city. And in that way, they took the city. And so it was overthrown by the Medes and the Persians. Daniel, of course, lived on and continued in office. But we come on to chapter 6 now. And this is another well-known story, Daniel in the lion's den. So Darius has now taken the throne. So he's reigning in Babylon. He only had a short reign, a couple of years. And it was during his reign then that his nobles tricked him, basically, so that they could bring about the downfall of Daniel. The only thing that, very interesting, the only thing that they could get him on was his righteousness, the fact that he prayed. And he refused to stop praying even when There was an edict to say that he had to. And so Daniel was thrown in the lion's den. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at pictures of Daniel in the lion's den, usually he's depicted as a young man. The reality is, if you look at the timeline, Daniel, at this point, he would have been from his early to mid-80s. So he was taken prisoner, he was taken into exile in 606 BC. This happened around about 537 BC. So we're looking at 60 years or more since then. And he was a young man when that happened. So amazingly, in his 80s, he still had high responsibility, to the point that Darius wanted to give him power over the whole realm. So an amazing testimony of Daniel's faithfulness right the way through his whole life. So we move on then to the second part of Daniel. Now this one contains prophecies. And chapter 7 then, we have a dream of Daniel that parallels the dream of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. So there's a strong parallel. So Daniel has this dream. He sees 4 beasts rising up one after another, which would represent 4 great powers. So first of all, he sees the lion in chapter 7, verse 4. And this lion had 4 wings of an eagle that would eventually be plucked. It stands on its feet like a man and has a man's heart. This symbolizes Nebuchadnezzar, whose empire would come to an end. The second beast that Daniel sees in chapter 7, verse 5 is a bear, and a bear that lifted itself up on one side and had 3 ribs between its teeth. So this then again represented the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes and the Persians got together with their ability to conquer lands. So inferior to Babylon, but second in power and with a greater appetite for conquest. Then the third beast, Daniel 7 verse 6, has 4 wings and 4 heads. And this would symbolize Greece, the empire of Greece. Its wings, this is a leopard. The beast is a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And this would symbolize Greece. Swift to conquest, the wings, breaks up into 4 parts. So the 4 heads. 4 of Alexander's generals take a quarter each of the empire. Then the fourth beast, chapter 7, verses 7 to 8. This is the most terrifying of all. Iron teeth, 10 horns, and this is the Roman Empire. And out of the 10 horns, there would appear a small horn. And chapter 7 has got some very interesting verses. So let me just read what Daniel saw in his vision. So Daniel chapter 7, verse 9. Well, let me go to verse 8. While I was thinking about the horns, now a horn in the Bible always represents strength. It's a symbol of strength. Another horn, a little horn, came out up among them. The 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. The Ancient of Days is God the Father. His clothing was as white as snow, his hair as white as like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. Ezekiel chapter 1 describes the wheels around the throne of God. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the book was opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words of the horn. Now this little horn is the Antichrist. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. Now this expression, son of man, is where Jesus obtained or referred back to. He often called himself the Son of Man, and it's a title for the Messiah. This is where it first appears. So the Messiah here, the Son of Man, is appearing before God the Father's throne, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. So God the Son, the Messiah, is in the presence of God the Father. He was given authority, as the Son was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting kingdom that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So when Jesus used the term Son of Man, yes, he was a human being as well as divine, but he was referring back to this messianic passage that demonstrates that the Son of Man, the Messiah, would have be given by God the Father rulership over all the world. So this little horn will oppress the people for a time, times, and half a time. That's another way of saying 3.5 years. A time is 1 year, times 2 years, and half a time is 6 months. So 3.5 years. And the Antichrist kingdom will be destroyed, and Christ will set up his eternal kingdom. So this is set in the last days, the time of the Antichrist in the last days. Daniel comes back to this. World powers will be overthrown. Jesus will reign forever. That's chapter 7. Chapter 8 sees the rise of the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, which is depicted as a two-horned ram. A ram was the symbol of Persia. You've got the Medes and the Persians together. And then the Greek Empire is represented by the goat, whose horn breaks into 4 horns, who, again, we've seen how these symbols represent Alexander. So chapter 8 then is more details about the rise of the Persian, Medes and the Persian Empire, and the Greek Empire. Now, then we come into chapter 9, which is a very important chapter when it comes to dealing with the last days. So, Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 to 27. Now, Daniel tells us that he'd been studying the book of Jeremiah. So, Jeremiah was a contemporary of Daniel, but Jeremiah was an older man, and by now he would have been dead for some time. But Daniel was studying Jeremiah's prophecies, and in Jeremiah 29:10 to 14, Jeremiah had foretold that the exile would last for 70 years. So Daniel was calculating it. He was there at the beginning, 606 BC, and he was calculating now in 539 BC, or no, probably a little later, a couple of years later than that, that the 70 years was almost up. So he's praying and saying, God, the 70 years is almost up. Time for the exiles to go home. Now, as he's praying this, he gets a visitation from an angel who gives him some information. And so in answer to his prayer, the angel gives Daniel a prophetic timetable. And he talks about 77s, or 70, King James Version is 70 weeks. Now, these 77s, they're weeks of years. We're talking prophetically now. So 7 times 70 is 490. So it's a period in total of 490 years, yet future for Daniel. And they're divided up into 3 parts. So 69 of them, that's 483 years, would lead up to the cutting off of the Anointed One. So you've got the first 7 years that would be a time of trouble. So, 7 times 7, which is 49 years. So you've got 49. You've got 49 years. Then this 490 years following on from that, and it would lead up to the time when the Messiah would be cut off. And the starting point for this prophetic clock is, Daniel is told, is when the edict goes out to restore the city of Jerusalem. So that went out on the 14th of March, 445 BC by King Artaxerxes. And we read about that in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. So just to look at this timetable then of these three periods, a total of 490 years divided into three parts, starting when the decree goes out. Now that we've got the starting date for that. So the first 7 sevens then, 49 years, the reference is it'll be a time of difficulty. So these are the years that are the rebuilding of Jerusalem and of the temple. And as we read through Nehemiah, it was a very difficult time. They were facing enemies all the time as they were rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the city. So that was the first 49 years. The second period of time, which was 62 sevens, which is 62 times 7 is 434 years. So following the 49 years, we've got 434 years, the second period, which is the run-up to the time when the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. So the rejection and crucifixion of Christ. So we've got Daniel was given a prophetic clock timetable. And so a number of people have actually done the calculations on this. So looking at the calculations up until Jesus will be cut off, the Messiah will be cut off. So a man called Sir Robert Anderson collaborated with the astronomer royal of his time to calculate the precise number of days to see how this prophecy of Daniel came about. So the starting point of this clock, prophetic clock, then was the 1st of Nisan in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. That's Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1, which has been calculated as being the 14th of March, 445 BC. Now, in the Bible, a year is 360 days, not 365. The prophetic year is 360. We can tell this because if we look at various scriptures like Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, and Genesis 8, verses 3 to 4, it shows that the 1 year is 360 days. Maybe that was the actual year before the flood. I don't know. And also Revelation chapter 11, verses 2 to 3, where 42 months is referred to as 1,260 days. Therefore, each month is 30 days each. So the prophetic clock then, each month is 30 days. So 69 times 7 times 360 days. So the whole period from the issuing of the decree down to the cutting off the Messiah is 173,880 days. Now you have to take into consideration leap years as well. And when all that calculation was done, it turned out that that number of days ended on the 6th of April 32 AD, which was Palm Sunday, when Jesus offered himself as Israel's king. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, but he was rejected and cut off. So that is quite remarkable that somebody's actually calculated to the day Daniel's prophecy when the anointed one would be cut off, and that was when he was rejected on Palm Sunday. So that there remains then one period of 7 years, so one more week of years, which is 7 years, and this is located at the end time, at the time of the Antichrist, who's going to desecrate the temple in Jerusalem. So Daniel inferred then from chapter 9 that this 1 week has yet to be fulfilled. The Antichrist will be cut off, but the seventh week refers to a time when the temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, and it will be desecrated by the Antichrist. So there's the 7 years yet to be fulfilled. And so many regard this then as the tribulation period, or rather the period that the Antichrist rules. The Antichrist will rule for 7 years. So if we look at Revelation chapter 6 right the way through to chapter 19, this is the period of tribulation that the Apostle John saw in the run-up to the coming of Christ. So a common interpretation of Daniel 9:27 then, which is, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now, Jesus actually refers back to this verse in Daniel when he refers the reader, or the writer of the gospel, Jesus refers the reader to this verse, the desolation of the temple that Daniel mentions. So it's yet future from Jesus' time. So we're looking at the end of time. So the 7 years then is the rule of the Antichrist. Is divided into two parts, 3.5 years and 3.5 years. And so many interpret those verses in Daniel as meaning that in the middle, that there'll be a 7-year covenant with the Jews where they can rebuild their temple and make sacrifices. And it's a well-known fact that all the ingredients for the temple are already there. They're just waiting for the political time when the temple can be rebuilt and everything can come together fairly quickly. And in the middle of that 7-year covenant, 3.5 years, the Antichrist will break that covenant, and this is when the Great Tribulation, the last 3.5 years, referred to in the book of the book of Revelation also, where the wrath of God will fall on the Antichrist, his followers. There'll be an unprecedented persecution of Israel, but it will end with the coming of Christ. So Daniel chapter 7 then is a chapter that is much poured over the timescale of the weeks of prophecy, the years of prophecy, and its connection to the book of Revelation. Yes, and as we come to the last 3 chapters, in chapter 10 then, something very interesting here is Daniel is praying and fasting for 3 weeks. Now remember, he's the prime minister of the biggest empire in the world at that time, so he's not able to fast without food. So he tells us that he had a very restricted diet in his fasting. It's often referred to as a Daniel fast. John Wesley used to fast with bread and water, so a very simple intake. So for three weeks, Daniel was praying and fasting. He didn't get an answer to his prayer until 21 days later, when an angel comes to visit him. And interestingly, the angel gives us a very interesting insight into what can be happening when we're praying. And he said to Daniel that when you were praying, the answer to your prayer came immediately. The answer was sent out immediately. But I was battling in the spirit realm demonic forces, powerful demonic forces. And so it's an insight into the spirit realm round about us, that when we're praying, if we don't get the answer immediately, it's not necessarily because God says no. There is a spiritual battle going on. But Daniel prayed and fasted through that spiritual battle. He didn't know it was going on, but he kept on praying and fasting. But it just demonstrates the power of praying and fasting, and one of the reasons for it, that as we're praying, as we're fasting, we're actually aiding angelic beings who are working on God's behalf and on our behalf. So as he prayed, the archangel Michael stepped in to assist the angel that came. So we need to pray, and if we can, we need to fast as well. Chapter 11, again, more details between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. This is north and south of Israel. So the north is Syria, the Seleucid kings, and the south is Egypt, the Ptolemies. More details of the battle between them, with Israel caught in the middle. And then finally, chapter 12, it looks forward right to the end time, looks forward to the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, mentioned by Jesus in Matthew 24:21, Revelation chapter 7, verse 14, and Revelation 13, verse 5. And it ends with reference to the final resurrection and the final day of judgment. So Daniel is looking now right the way through millennia, 2.5 millennia to our current time, and we're still waiting, but signs are that we're very close to the end. And Daniel is told to seal up the prophecy. He's told that these prophecies are for the end of time, not his time. And he's also indicated at the time the prophecies come into being, there'll be a great deal of travel and there'll be a great deal of knowledge. Well, we live in a generation where there's never been so much travel by air, other ways, and knowledge increases. I don't know, does it double every 5 years or something like that? But the amount of knowledge is increasing exponentially. So we're living in the days that Daniel foretold. We're living in the days that Ezekiel foretold. So Jesus said, when you see all these things coming to be, look up, because your redemption draws near. We're not told a time, we're not told a date, we're not told a year, we're just told circumstances. And when we look at the circumstances, we need to be ready, Jesus said. So that brings us then to the end of the book of Daniel.